So we're going to start a new series tonight in the book of Romans. So we called this When in Romans, Stay in Context. And you'll find out more of why we named it that, or why I named it that, as we dig in. So if you got a Bible with you, open to Romans chapter 1. We're going to read a couple verses out of that in a little while. Next week, we'll actually start going verse by verse through chapter 1. But we'll get to that in a minute. Romans is great. I love Romans, but here's the thing. It's one of the most popular books of the Bible, but it's also one of the most misunderstood books of the Bible, or you might even say misused books of the Bible. Many people read Romans without considering the context and situation Paul is addressing. Okay, with everything you read in Scripture, there is a context behind it that usually we're not aware of. We have to dig a little deeper because a lot of times they're not going to tell you the context because they're writing to people who are already in that context. Make sense? Right? So there's a situation and context to this letter that most people are not considering when they're reading the book of Romans. So what we're going to do in this series, and it's going to take us a while, so just might as well settle in and get used to, we're going to be in Romans on Wednesday night for a long time. And y'all should be used to that. I mean, we spent 20-something weeks in Revelation and John and Corinthians and all that, so we're kind of used to that. But the purpose of this series is to help you read Romans in context. Because I'm sure if I were to test you right now on what is the context and situation that Paul's talking about in Romans, I bet most of you don't know. And that's not your fault. It's not like Paul spells it out for you, right? We have to do a little bit more legwork. So, and that's just how the Bible works, okay? We're reading literature that is almost 2,000 years old. So there's going to be some stuff we have to learn when approaching those ancient documents. Am I making sense? So Paul didn't spell that out. So I've had people ask me this, like, okay, if we have to do all this legwork to figure out, research to figure out the context behind the books of the Bible, why didn't they just write that into the Bible so we would know it? And my answer to that is, well, imagine I'm going to write a letter to our church in the year 2022 or 2021, okay? And there's all kinds of struggles going on in that year, right? So if I'm writing about, okay, let's do a hypothetical here. Think about what churches were dealing with in the middle of COVID, right? Now, you may not have experienced much of this, but I talked to other people who were in other churches, and I heard a lot of things. Some churches completely split over how to deal with COVID. You had the mask people that you should let nobody in here that doesn't have a mask on or two masks on, right? Then there were the group, nobody should be coming to church that isn't vaccinated. Then there was the group, we should never shut down church no matter what anybody says. We should be meeting. Then there's the group, no, we should be shutting down church because we're going to get sick and die. And everybody was fighting and divided. There were churches that completely split apart over those issues. There were big donors, people who gave a lot of money to their church that took their money and threatened their pastors. If you don't do it the way I'm telling you to do it, I'm taking my money to somebody else's church. I personally know pastors that had that happen to them, right? So if I were going to write a letter to the church during that time period, I would talk about those issues and try to correct those issues, but I wouldn't have to tell you, oh, by the way, there's this thing called COVID, and this is what was going on at the time. Why would I not need to tell you that? Because you're already living it. I don't need to spell all that out. The same thing's going on in the letters in the New Testament. He's writing to churches. They already know their situation. He doesn't have to spell it all out for them. They're already living it. It'd be a waste of paper. And remember, paper is expensive. Writing is expensive. To get a copy of the book of Romans in Paul's day would have cost you the equivalent of about $5,000 in today's money to get one copy of one book of the Bible in your hands to take home with you. So they're not wasting any paper. Am I making sense? Right? So this whole context thing is really, really important. So what we're going to do throughout this series, and tonight is just the introduction. I'm just going to introduce Romans to you and teach you some things about the context before we actually dive into it. Next week we'll dive into verse 1. Okay? So this is going to be kind of a fire hydrant moment, all right? Just soak it in. There'll be time for questions in a little while. Everybody good? All right, I'll try to move quickly. And I said try. Who wrote Romans? Well, Paul is the author, meaning he's the one giving the information, okay? In verse 1, it starts out with Paul, a servant or a slave of Christ Jesus, right? So Paul is the author of Romans. However, Paul didn't actually write it down, because at the end, in chapter 16, you find this statement in the middle of nowhere, like Paul is greeting, hey, say hello to so-and-so, and say hello to this person, tell this person that I love them, or tell this person we're praying for them, or whatever. He goes through that in chapter 16 as he's closing it out. And then right out of nowhere in verse 22, you get, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you. So if you read Romans and you got there, you're like, wait, who wrote this? I thought Paul wrote this. So did Paul write this, or did Tertius write this? Yes. Here's how this worked, okay? So Paul by the way, Paul did not write with his hand any of his letters. And he tells you that in every one of his letters, just about every one. He tells you who's the one. So a lot of times it'll start with Paul and Timothy to the church in so-and-so. Timothy's the one writing it down. Paul's the one dictating it. So here's how this would work. Paul would sit with a scribe, or the technical term in Greek is amanuensis, which is like a writing secretary, right? So what he would do is he would sit with them and he would talk and tell them to write down what he's saying. The scribe would then write it down and also make sure the grammar's correct and stuff like that. And he would then read it back to Paul. And Paul would say, well, no, you missed this part right here, or you changed this, and I don't want you to change that. I want you to say it just like this. And by the time they're done with it, then it's finished. Then it would be sent, because in the ancient world, there was no like Roman postal service, right? Like we have a U.S. postal service that's very ineffective. But anyway, there was no Rome postal service, okay? If you needed to send a letter, you had to have somebody go take it for you. Right? So you would send it, and that person would deliver the letter. But the person delivering the letter would also have sat with the author and like learned exactly what you mean by these things so that I can answer questions. Now, it's very likely that Phoebe, who's mentioned in the beginning of chapter 16, is the one who took the letter to Rome and read it to the churches in Rome, right? And she would have been prepared by Paul to answer questions. Now, if you've ever read Romans, you know you probably don't want that job. There's some confusing stuff in Romans, right? Even Peter says in his letter, Paul writes some things that are hard to understand, right? But it's very likely that Phoebe is the one doing it because of what he says about her. He says, I commend to you. In other words, I'm behind this person. I've approved of them. I commend to you Phoebe. Welcome her and help her with anything she needs. He only usually says that to the person who's delivering the letter in his other books. So this is how the New Testament works. This is how writing worked. This is why in some of Paul's letters at the end, you'll see him say, now look at what big letters I write with my own hand. Well, that tells you right there he wasn't writing up to that point. He's just letting you know, hey, this is me. This is kind of like my signature, okay? So this is how it worked. Does it make sense? Right? Okay, so Paul is the author. He's not the one actually writing on the paper, though, but he's the source of the information. Okay, now the question is, what is Romans? Because we call it a book, right? The book of Romans, okay? Well, there's some popular views about what Romans is and how it should be used. One is the Romans Road of Salvation. You ever heard that? The Romans Road, let me take you down the Romans Road. Usually if somebody's trying to get you saved, they'll take you to the Romans Road. And what they do is they take passages out of Romans, which are wonderful passages, and it kind of tells the gospel story, right? Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The next one is Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And then it goes on and on and on. If you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you will be saved, right? And you take them through, and that's the Romans Road to Salvation. That's great. But it unintentionally teaches us that that's all Romans is about. And it unintentionally teaches us to take passages out of context. Right? Now, I'm not saying that's intentional. I think taking somebody down the Romans road is not a bad thing. It does help them understand what their problem is, sin, what the wages of sin is, what the gift of God is, and how to become a follower of Jesus. In a very general way, it will kind of help them with that. But that's not the point of the book of Romans. There's a whole other thing going on in Romans that we miss if we make it all about our personal salvation. Make sense? Okay. Now, I've been to a theological school, so I'm going to talk about these next 2 points for a second. A lot of people, a huge amount of people, think that Romans is Paul's theological treatise. A treatise is a genre of literature. Okay, in the ancient world, we know exactly what those are. So we have those written by other people and church fathers. So you'll have one of the church fathers will write, these are people after the apostles, they will write a book called On the Resurrection of Christ. Well, that's a whole thing written to teach you a theological idea. What is the resurrection? What does it mean? How did it happen? Right? That's a treatise. Romans is not that. Okay, it is not in that genre. We know what that looks like. That's not the style that Romans is written in. The other thing, especially that I was taught in Bible college, is that Romans is Paul's systematic theology book. Now, you don't know what systematic theology is, and thank God you don't. Okay? I used to be in the systematic theology thing. I thought that was the way everything worked. That's a new idea. Paul never heard of systematic theology. Okay? So he's not doing that, obviously. He'd never heard of it. Okay? So that's not what this is. What Romans is what's called an epistle, which means letter. It's a letter. And all of Paul's letters are letters. They're not theological reference books that you can pick things out of context and build a systematic theology with. That's not why he wrote it. Okay? He is doing theology, but he's doing it in the form of a letter. Now, here's why this is important. An epistle, whether it's from Paul or Peter or James or whoever, well, James is not a letter, it's a sermon, but that's another topic for Sunday. An epistle is written to a specific place, people, and time, right? If you write someone a letter, a personal letter to someone, that's a specific place it's going to, specific person or group of people at a specific time, right? Right? Now, if I just write a book on how to follow Jesus and I publish it, that's not a letter, is it? No, that's some kind of theological treatise that I'm giving. And that's not what Romans is. Romans is a letter, and it's addressing, every one of Paul's letters is addressing a specific situation or occasion or a reason, right? Here's an example. We went through 1 Corinthians for 20-something weeks, right? Okay? That was very situational, wasn't it? He had some very specific things that he knew were going on in the church that he started. And he's writing a letter to those people to correct those things. And you got to know that context if you're going to interpret it correctly. Make sense? Okay. Romans is like that. There's a slight difference in that Paul didn't start the church in Rome and he hadn't been there yet, but he's heard of what's going on. So he's writing to a specific situation. If you don't know that situation, you are misunderstanding the book. Somewhere you're going to misunderstand it. All of Paul's letters are situational. So the question is, what is the specific situation in Romans? Okay, because Romans is written to a church, which means they're already Christians. He's not preaching to the lost. He's talking to the church. All right, so what is the situation? Okay, here's the part that you probably never heard before, but it's so important, okay? Paul wrote Romans around 56, possibly 57 AD, okay, from Cenchreae, which is a port city that's adjacent to Corinth, okay? And we know this because he mentions Phoebe, who's delivering the letter probably, and she's from Cenchreae. She's actually a deaconess in the church in Cenchreae, which is close to Corinth. Now, Paul did not plant the Roman church, okay? These people got saved at Pentecost, went back to Rome, and grew that community. He hasn't been there yet. He tells you that in chapter 1. I've been trying to get to you, but I've never got to you yet. He hadn't visited them yet. Now, the Roman church began, just like all the other churches began, predominantly Jewish. Because Jesus was a Jew, all of his apostles were Jews, right? So all these new churches begin predominantly Jewish. However, Emperor Claudius in AD 49, and you can read about this in Acts 18, he expelled all the Jews from Rome. We not only know this from the Bible, we have Roman historical documents that tell us about this event. And here's what happened. There was some kind of disagreement and just a big drama going on about someone named Chrestus, is how the Roman historian spells Christ. So the Jews were arguing about the Messiah, apparently, and this instigated some stuff, and the emperor got sick of it, so he expelled all the Jews from Rome. Well, that includes Jewish Christians, right? There weren't two separate religions. There were Jews who accepted the Messiah, the Christians. There were Jews who didn't. They were still Jews. All of them are Jews, right? So all of them get expelled from the city of Rome. So the Roman church during that time becomes predominantly Gentile, while all the Jews are expelled. But Claudius dies in AD 54, and all the Jews get to go back home. So the Jews come back home, the Jewish Christians come back home to their church and find their church is now is all Gentile and acting like Gentiles. Do you see how that might be an issue for some people who've been raised Jewish their whole life? Let me give you some ideas of what might have been happening. The gatherings have become less Jewish. They're probably not quoting the Psalms as prayers as much as they used to, because these Gentiles don't know all that stuff. They weren't raised in it. There's dietary differences. They come back to their home church, and at the fellowship time, they're just sitting around eating bacon and ham. And all these Jews are like, that's unclean. And there's disputes about that. You can read about it later on in Romans. He brings this up. There's ritual differences. You got all these uncircumcised Gentiles, and what are we supposed to do with this? Do they need to follow all these same rituals? Do they need to practice the Sabbath on Saturday? How are we going to manage this? Because this was going great while we were here, and we got expelled for a few years, and now we're back and our church looks totally different, right? So imagine you love your church, and then you got exiled from Perry, and when you came back, we were playing death metal for the worship time. I mean, it's still worship lyrics, but we're screaming and growling the lyrics, and there's, I would love it. Y'all would hate it, but I would be fine with it. And everything's different. Everything's changed. People are dressed differently, and it just feels wrong. You get it? So that's what Jimmy said. It would be wrong, right? Death metal worship might be a little edgy. The other thing that happened is the leadership has changed. This church started as a predominantly Jewish church, which means the leaders of that church would have been Jews early on, but they were expelled. A few years later, they come back and Gentiles are in charge by necessity. So some influence has changed as well. What this leads to, and you will start to see this as you read Romans, okay, because your homework is going to be to read the whole book in one sitting. It's 16 chapters. It doesn't take as long as you think. But as you read through it with this context, you're going to notice all this now that you probably skipped over because you didn't understand what he was talking about. So what's going on is the Jewish people in the Roman church are being judgmental and looking down on the Gentile Christians in the Roman church, and the Gentile Christians are judging and looking down on the Jewish Christians. Both of them are wrong. And it's causing division. How they're treating each other are wrong. And Paul's heard about that, and he's not able to get there to correct it, so he writes a letter. Am I making sense? Okay? So, here we go. Paul wrote Romans to address the tensions between Jewish and Gentile believers in the Roman church. Paul is trying to prevent division even though it's already going on. What his fear is that the Roman church is going to split into a Jewish church and a Gentile church in Rome. There's going to be first and second church. You hear me? And for Paul, that's deadly. We can't have churches splitting up over stuff like this. So he's writing this letter to prevent that from happening. So Romans is written also to explain how the gospel has brought both Jews and Gentiles into God's family as one family. And that's where you get into chapters 9 through 11, where everybody gets really confused because we don't understand what Paul's trying to do. He's trying to help the Gentiles in those chapters understand why God is doing it this way. Okay? This will make more sense as we study it. Okay, everybody still awake? All right. So here's the structure of Romans. Here's the simple way to look at it, okay? And there's people, if you go Google this, there's people that vehemently disagree with this, and almost all of those people are Calvinists, Reformed theologians. Anyway, so Romans in two parts. There's some great books about this. Two-part Romans is called one. There's a new one that just came out that I read in the last couple weeks about this topic. And basically, here's how it's split up, if you think of it in a simple way. Paul is addressing the Jewish Christians in the Roman church in the first 8 chapters. Then he turns and says, now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. He literally says that in chapters 9 through 11. So this is how you need to think about the book. There's 2 different audiences in the same church that he's addressing. Right now you're thinking, who cares? Go read Romans all the way through and you'll see why this matters. Because you get to chapters 9 through 11 and you go, what is he talking about? It makes a lot of sense, though, if you know this context. So this is Romans in 2 parts. Here's how I like to look at Romans as far as the outline. You got your introduction and greeting in the first 15 verses. We're going to cover those next Wednesday. Paul's thesis statement, which we'll read here in a minute, is verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1, where he says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. That's important, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. Half of it's written to the Jews, half to the Gentiles in Romans. So then he's going to do what I call the setup, okay? That passage where he talks about how everybody went off into idolatry and worship the creature rather than the creator, and that's, homosexuality and all these crazy sex acts come out of that idolatry, and then all these other terrible things, it just spirals out of control. Paul's doing that to make the Jews think he's talking about the Gentiles, and then when chapter 2 starts, it's like a curveball or like a sucker punch. Because then he goes, oh, by the way, who are you to judge that? You did the same things. And then he talks to the Jews. So he sets them up by making them think I'm talking about those pagan Gentile idolaters. And in chapter 2, he says, I'm actually talking about you. Because guess what Israel did? They were idolaters. That's why they went into exile. Right? You still with me? So chapters 2 through 8, his argument repeatedly is, you're not better off because you're Jewish. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's why he says that. He's trying to say, all of you, Jews and Gentiles, are sinners. Because the Jews tended to think they're not sinners. Right? I mean, just look at what Jesus was dealing with the Jewish people in the Gospel of John. He says something about slavery, and they go, we have been enslaved to no one. We're children of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. What? Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, the Persians, Alexander the Great. You could just keep on. You've been slaves the whole time you've been in existence, right? There's only about 200 years of Israel's history that they weren't enslaved to somebody in the Bible, right? So he's saying you're not any better off just because you're Jewish and you're a child of Abraham, right? So he spends chapters 2 through 8 talking about all that in multiple different ways. Then he switches to talking to the Gentiles to let them know you're not any better than the Jews because you're not Jewish. Do you see what's going on? It's like a double-edged sword. Hey, you Jews, you think you're better than the Gentiles just because you're Jewish. You're not. You're all in sin. Oh, you Gentiles think you're cool because you can eat bacon. You're not any better than the Jewish people, right? Matter of fact, you've been grafted into the Jewish family. So you're kind of indebted to them. They are the foundation on which you stand. That's what he argues in 9 through 11. The application to all that begins with the word therefore in chapter 12, verse 1, and that's the hinge. The same thing happens in his other letters, like in Ephesians. The first 3 chapters of Ephesians is all this theological stuff, and then in chapter 4 it goes, therefore, and he tells you what to do with all that. So in chapters 12 through 15, he gives them practical things about how to treat one another, how there's some of you that you're strong because you don't have to worry about these dietary things, and you think those people are weak, and this is how you need to treat each other, right? So it's all about unity in those chapters. That's the application. And then chapter 16 is a conclusion where basically he says what's up to a bunch of different people. Just a long list of people. Say hello to so-and-so, say hello to so-and-so, commend this person, yada, yada, yada. And then Tertius butts in there. Oh, by the way, I'm writing this, and then it ends. Okay, so that's kind of the outline. Here's Paul's thesis statement. You still with me? 7:14. All right. Chapter 1, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. And to stop there, the gospel is more than here's how to get to heaven. In Paul's mind, the gospel is a huge thing. It's a whole story from Genesis to Revelation. It's not just pray this so you miss hell and hit heaven, right? I'm not ashamed of this gospel I'm about to lay out for you, right? That's what he's doing. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. What word might should go there? Believes. Faithful. To everyone who is faithful to Christ. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek or the Gentiles. To the Jew first, then to the Gentiles. If you go read the book of Acts about Paul's missionary journeys, you'll find out that every city he goes into, he goes to the Jewish synagogue first. And he preaches the gospel to them. They're the ones most primed to hear and understand what's going on. They're the ones who even know what a Messiah is, at least some version of that. Then when they would usually they would beat him and throw him out in the street and didn't want to hear him anymore, then he'd go over where all the philosophers, the Greek philosophers were in the middle of town, and he'd preach there. He would go to the Jew first, then to the Gentile. Where'd he get that idea from? From Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus always went to the Jews, and then he sent his apostles out to the Gentile cities, right? Acts chapter 1 begins with that. Before he ascends, what does he tell them? He says, you start here in Jerusalem, then to Samaria, then to the ends of the earth, right? To the Jew first, then to the Greek. For in it, and it would be the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, or the justice of God is revealed from faith for faith, for it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And we'll unpack all that next week. But this not ashamed thing is important. The Jews tended to be ashamed to be in the same room with Gentiles. You can read the Gospels and see it all over the place. When they want to crucify Jesus, so they go to Pilate's house at night, they won't even walk in to his palace because they thought it would defile them and they couldn't celebrate Passover the next day. Jews, even Jewish Christians, were struggling with the idea that we're in the same group with Gentiles and they're unclean. They eat bacon, they're uncircumcised, they don't practice purity rituals, and they tended to be ashamed about that. You can also see this in Galatians where Paul confronts Peter to his face because Peter was like hanging out and being all Jewish or actually was hanging out and having a good time with the Gentiles until some of the Jewish guys walked in the room, and then he'd go across the room and be Jewish. And Paul said, you're wrong for doing that. So when he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he's saying what I'm about to lay out to you, I'm not ashamed of it at all. Some of you might be, but I'm not. And we need to get this right. Am I making sense? Okay. Okay, one more thing. Y'all got a few more minutes? Can you hang with me? Let's talk about this. We'll dig into it real deep when we get to chapter 9 in like a year and a half. Jews, the word Jews and the word Israel, is there a difference? Now, I'm sure you're like I was until I learned this stuff. Jew and Israel is the same thing. That's what I always thought. That's not true. It was true at one time, but in Paul's day it wasn't. Jews were part of Israel, but just because you're a Jew doesn't mean you're part of God's family. And just because you are Israelite doesn't make you a Jew. How confusing is that? Let me try to explain. Israel began as one nation, but 12 tribes, right? Jacob, who was renamed Israel, had 12 sons. They fathered the 12 tribes of Israel, okay? About 975 BC, Israel splits into two kingdoms. This is at the death of Solomon. So Solomon has disobeyed God. Sometimes he got it right. Most of the time he messed it up big time. And the kingdom splits into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom is 10 tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom is 2 tribes. Southern kingdom is Judah and Benjamin and some Levites, because they're the priest, right? That's where the temple's at in the southern kingdom, Judea, Jerusalem, right? The northern kingdom is Israel, 10 tribes. They go full-blown into idolatry, okay? And so about 722 BC, Assyria conquers the northern kingdom of Israel. They're called Israel. Southern kingdom is called Judah. Judea, is where the word Jew comes from. Jew means Judean. It means you're from that southern kingdom. The 10 tribes get conquered in 722 around that year. And those 10 tribes are dispersed into the other nations. That's how Assyria did things. They didn't take you captive. They would come take you and then send you out into other nations. The whole purpose of that was to get rid of you as a people. Because if I disperse you into all these other nations, you interbreed with everybody else and you no longer exist. Your nationality no longer exists. That's exactly what happened to the 10 tribes. Have you ever heard the phrase, the lost 10 tribes of Israel? This is where this comes from, okay? They were lost. I don't mean eternally like they went to hell. I mean they don't exist anymore. Because they integrated into the Gentiles, they never came back. This is why the Jews don't like Samaritans. Samaria is what the northern kingdom used to be. And they're claiming to be Israelites, and the Jews are going, you're not Israelites, you're Gentiles. Because they literally are Gentiles, okay? About 586, Judah is exiled to Babylon, but they get to come back after 70 years and rebuild the city. That's Ezra and Nehemiah, right? They rebuild the city and the temple. Judah and Benjamin, they keep existing in the area of Judea. That's where the word Jew comes from, okay? Just hang with me. So by the time of Jesus and the apostles, Israel are Gentiles. The Jews are the only Israelites that still exist. And that's Judah and Benjamin. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. The apostle Paul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Judea, they're Jews, right? In the book of Romans, because you're looking at me like, who cares? Why does this matter for reading Romans? Here's why. Paul uses the term Jew with the pronouns we and us for the first 8 chapters. But in chapter 9, he starts saying you and you also, and he's talking to the Gentiles, and he uses the word Israel, and he doesn't use the word Jew. Let me try to make sense out of that. The whole thing that Paul is doing is letting the Gentiles know that God is saving you in order to keep his promises to all of Israel. Because the 10 tribes, Israel, became Gentiles, right? That's what we just established. So the reason why the gospel goes to the Gentiles is to keep his promises to all Israel. And in that way, all Israel will be saved, which is in Romans 11, I think. Okay, don't worry if you're confused as all get out like you look like you are. We'll dig into this again when we get to those chapters. But it's important to tell you this now because I want you to read the whole book of Romans before we come back next time, okay? And I want you to notice this stuff, okay? So Paul's explaining to the Gentiles, you have been grafted into this family, and the Jewish people there are hearing this and going, okay, this makes sense now. I was wondering why we let all these smelly Gentiles in here with their bacon. Why are we doing this? Paul's saying, here's why we're doing this, because the old covenant said there's a new covenant. And that's where we're at now. And the new covenant says the Gentiles will come back in, and that is Israel, because Israel had become Gentiles. So we'll get to all that, but all that's important context to have before you approach the book. If you don't have that, you're missing all of that in the text, and you just get to those passages and you go, oh, okay, let's just flip it. Let's go back to Matthew. That was easier, right? I get it. So here's some key vocabulary that we're going to talk about as we go through this book. I'm not going to define them tonight, but we will as we go through the book. The wrath of God is a very important thing that you know what that means in the book of Romans, because it gets mentioned. In chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, he's going to explain what the wrath of God is. Spoiler alert. The wrath of God is God letting you have what you want. It's not God raining down punishments on you, although that could be the wrath of God as well. But that's not how Paul defines it. Paul defines it clearly as God gave them over to their own desires. He says that is the wrath of God revealed. Okay, we'll get there in a couple weeks. You need to pay attention to the word Jew, Israel, Gentile, or Greek. So I'll give you your homework in a minute, but I want you to pay attention to those terms as you're reading through Romans. When you get to chapters 12 through 16, you need to look for the words the weak and the strong. And I'll explain which one's which when we get that far. But I just want you to notice those two terms because that's referring to the two groups in the Roman church, the Jewish and the Gentile, right? Pay attention to the pronouns when Paul says we or us, because he's including himself in the discussion. And then notice when he says you or you also. Now he's usually talking to the Gentiles, right? Note the words faith, and if you are okay writing in your Bible, just write faithful or faithfulness. That will change how you read some very popular passages in Romans. Okay? Grace and gift, which by the way in Greek are very similar terms. Right? So charis is grace, and then chara can mean gift. It's the same root. Okay? The law, when you read the law in Romans, I want you to write the Torah. Paul's not talking about Roman law, and he's certainly not talking about American law. And he's not talking about just moral law in general. He's talking about the Torah. And then he uses the phrase works of the law, which since the 1500s, we've interpreted that to mean any good works. That is not what Paul means at all. And we'll explain that as we get there. He's specifically talking about the things in the Torah that were specific to the Jewish people. Justification and righteousness, which in Greek is the same exact word. Okay? Those are two very important things in the book of Romans that are very misunderstood in today's theology. And then sin, trespass, transgression, note where that's at when you read through Romans. And then in chapter 5, he's going to talk about death, and you need to read that passage very closely. Because people have twisted that and made it say something it is not saying. Okay? So we'll get there when we get there. I love this. It's like a bunch of teasers. Like, here's a bunch of questions that I'm not going to answer yet. Okay, so next week, here's a for sure you have to read the first 17 verses of the book of Romans. You've got to do that part before next week so you're familiar with it. But if you're a good Christian, I want you to read all of Romans in one sitting. It doesn't take you that long. You can do it. I believe in you. Just do it. Read it, because this is how the Roman church heard Romans all at one time. Phoebe, or whoever it might have been, stood up, got the church together, and said, we got a letter from Paul. And she sang the Blues Clues song, we just got a letter. And but then she read, or he, whoever it was, read the entire letter in one sitting and performed it. Paul would have prepared her. We know this is how they did it back then. He would have prepared the reader to look at certain groups of people at certain points of the letter. So they know for sure, I'm talking to you in this part. I'm talking to you guys in this part. How would they have known? Because Jewish people dress differently than Gentiles. So you might be really focused on this group that's dressed differently for the first 8 chapters, right? They would have heard the whole thing in one sitting. So I want you to read that whole thing in one sitting, or get on your Bible app, because it'll read it to you. And just sit and imagine yourself in ancient Rome in the church listening to someone read this whole letter to you, and you've never heard it before. And I want you to keep these things in mind we talked about and just listen for those things. You can do it more than once, okay? I promise you won't go to hell if you listen to something repetitively. All right? It's good for you. So go through the whole thing. If you're reading it in your Bible, though, I want you to mark wherever it says Jew or Gentile or Israel or Israelite. I want you to circle the pronouns like we and us, or you also, or you were included too. Circle those things. That's very important for you to see that distinction in the book. So I want you to do all of that. And then next week we're going to come back and we'll start going verse by verse through the first 17 verses, which is Paul's introduction. And here's why I want you to be here next week. Remember, those of you who are here in the Gospel of John and in the book of Revelation, the first section of that book introduced these like words and phrases that were themes that were going to come up later. Remember that? Paul does the same thing in his letters. And I'm going to show you some of that in the first 17 verses. He mentions certain topics and phrases that the rest of the book is going to play out. Okay? So that's what we're going to do next week, is I'm going to show you those things, and then I'll connect them to different passages throughout the book in the notes, so you can go home and kind of chase them down and see what's happening. Okay? So that's what we'll talk about next time.